The crowd fell silent as Thomas Adair placed a leather pouch on the wooden table. 100 gold pieces, he announced, his deep voice cutting through the tension. Eleanor Mitchell stood on the auction block, tears streaming down her face, as her own father refused to meet her gaze. The wealthy men who moments ago had been eagerly bidding on her now stared in disbelief at the Cherokee man who had outbid them all. William Mitchell's face contorted with rage as he counted the gold, more money than he'd ever seen, yet his greed overwhelmed his prejudice. "Sold!" he spat, slamming his gavel down. Instead of claiming Eleanor as his prize, Thomas untied her, bound wrists, placed his coat around her shoulders, and led her away from the crowd, whispering, "You are not property to be owned. You are free to choose your own path." Eleanor looked back at her father one last time, realizing that the man who had raised her had never truly seen her at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up at Mitchell's Crossing, Eleanor, known to most as Ellie, had always felt the weight of her father's disappointment. The sprawling Tennessee farmstead should have produced a son, her father often muttered when deep in his cups. Instead, Margaret Mitchell had given him a daughter before succumbing to fever when Ellie was only 5 years old. William Mitchell had never remarried, choosing instead to pour his frustrations into expanding his holdings and his influence in the growing settlement of Pinecrest Valley. Ellie had learned early to make herself useful. By 12, she could manage the household accounts better than her father, whose ambitions often exceeded his business acumen. By 16, she was effectively running the farm while William spent his days at Hayes's Tavern, boasting of imagined successes and making deals that rarely materialized. Now at 20, Ellie had resigned herself to a life of quiet servitude, finding moments of joy in her friendship with Becky Williams and her secret excursions to Creek Valley, where she sketched the wildlife and practiced the herbal medicine. Her mother had begun teaching her before death stole her away. "You've got your mother's eyes," Dr. Samuel Grant told her whenever she brought him wildflowers for his patients, and her healing touch too. The aging doctor had been teaching Ellie whenever she could slip away from her father's demands, recognizing in her the same compassionate intelligence he'd admired in Margaret. Ellie never mentioned these lessons to her father. William Mitchell had little patience for what he called women's foolishness. His respect was reserved for men of wealth and power, qualities he desperately coveted for himself, which was why, when Edgar Blackwood first visited Mitchell's Crossing, William had practically fallen over himself to impress the silver-haired businessman from Nashville. "Your farm sits on an ideal location," Blackwood had observed, examining. A map spread across the dining table Ellie had polished to a shine that morning. "The railroad company is planning to extend their line through this region next year." William's eyes had gleamed with avarice. "I've always said this land was worth more than these simple townspeople realize." "Indeed," Blackwood had agreed, his gaze drifting to Ellie as she served coffee. Something in that look had made her skin crawl. At 55, Blackwood was more than twice her age, with cold eyes that assessed her as they might evaluate a horse or a parcel of land. "Your daughter has grown into quite a beauty." William had barely glanced at Ellie. "Takes after her mother. Is she promised to anyone?" Blackwood's question had been directed at William, as though Ellie weren't standing right there. "Not. Yet few worthy prospects in a town like this." Blackwood had smiled then, revealing teeth stained by tobacco. "Perhaps we should discuss that as well as our business arrangements." That night, Ellie had overheard them talking on the porch, their voices carrying through her bedroom window. "5,000 for the property rights is generous," Blackwood had said, "but I'm prepared to offer another 1,000 if the girl is included in our agreement." Ellie had frozen, unable to believe what she was hearing. "She's stubborn like her mother," William had replied. the clink of glasses punctuating his words. Got notions about medicine and drawing pictures instead of tending to proper wifely duties. I find that spirited women often settle nicely into domesticity with the right guidance, Blackwood had said with a chuckle that turned Ellie's blood cold. To her horror, her father had laughed along with him. The next morning, Ellie had confronted William as he nursed his hangover at the breakfast table. "You can't possibly be considering Mr. Blackwood's offer," she'd said, hands trembling as she poured his coffee. William hadn't even looked up. "Don't eavesdrop on men's business, Eleanor. It's unbecoming. I am not property to be sold." The coffee cup had slammed down, liquid sloshing onto the table. "You are my daughter, and you will do as I say. Blackwood can provide for you better than any man in this backward town, and his connections will make us wealthy beyond your imagination." "I don't care about wealth," Ellie had argued, her voice rising despite her effort to remain calm. "And I won't marry a man old enough to be my grandfather, especially one who looks at me like—" The slap had come without warning, sending her staggering against the wall. William had never struck her before, and the shock of it had silenced her more effectively than the burning pain across her cheek. "You'll do as you're told," he'd growled, standing over her. "I've indulged your willfulness too long. Your mother filled your head with nonsense, but it's time you learned your place." Ellie had fled to her room, mind racing. That afternoon, she'd slipped away to the Williams homestead, seeking counsel from her friend Becky. "You can stay here," Becky had offered immediately, her round face creased with concern as she examined the bruise blooming on Ellie's cheek. "Pa won't mind. He's always said your father doesn't deserve you." But Ellie had shaken her head. "He'd come for me, and your family doesn't need trouble with my father and his new friend." "Then what will you do?" Ellie had no answer. Running away seemed impossible. A single woman alone on the frontier faced dangers perhaps worse than an unwanted marriage. Yet staying meant becoming Blackwood's possession, a fate she couldn't bear to contemplate. It was Becky who had mentioned Thomas Adair. "He trades with Pa sometimes," she'd explained. "He's Cherokee, but he moves between their world and ours. They say his mother was white, captured as a girl, but chose to stay with her captors. He knows the territories better than anyone. If anyone could help you escape safely, it might be him." The name had been vaguely familiar to Ellie. She recalled glimpses of a tall, broad-shouldered man with copper skin and eyes like midnight, keeping to himself at Donovan's general store. The other townsfolk gave him a wide berth, their expressions a mixture of fear and grudging respect. "Where would I find him?" Ellie had asked, desperation overcoming her reservation. "He has a cabin near Creek Valley, where the old trapper's path crosses the stream." Becky had squeezed her hand. "But Ellie, be careful. The stories about him, some say he's dangerous." "More dangerous than being sold to Blackwood," Ellie had replied grimly. Returning home that evening, Ellie had found her father entertaining not only Blackwood, but several other prominent men from town, including Henry Donovan, the merchant who owned the general store, and Sheriff Cooper, whose authority William had always been eager to curry favor with. Their laughter had echoed from the parlor as Ellie slipped upstairs, but not before she overheard a fragment of conversation that chilled her to the bone. "Auction would settle it fairly," Donovan was saying. "If Blackwood isn't the only interested party." Gentlemen," her father had interjected. "I'm flattered by the interest in my daughter, but Mr. Blackwood and I have an understanding." "An understanding isn't a contract," Sheriff Cooper had pointed out. "And if there's more money to be had—" Ellie had pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle her gasp. They were discussing her as if she were livestock to be sold at the county fair. Even the sheriff, whom she'd believed to be an honorable a man, was participating in this obscene conversation. That night, she'd packed a small bundle, a change of clothes, her mother's locket, the meager savings she'd managed to hide from her father, and her cherished sketchbook. At dawn, she would seek out Thomas Adair and beg for his help, whatever the risk. But dawn had brought rain, and with it, disaster. As Ellie had attempted to saddle her horse in the pre-dawn gloom, a stable hand had discovered her and alerted William. Her father, still half-drunk from the previous night's revelry, had dragged her back to the house in full view of the awakening farm workers. "Ungrateful wretch," he'd roared, tossing her bundle into the mud. "After everything I've done for you, you've done nothing but use me," Ellie had shot back, past caring about the consequences of her defiance. "And now you plan to sell me, like cattle." Her words, spoken in anger and loud enough for several workers to hear. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Had apparently given William an idea. His expression had shifted from rage to calculation. "You want to be treated like property?" he'd hissed, gripping her arm painfully. "Then property you shall be. Let's see what the good men of Pinecrest Valley think you're worth." 3 days later, Eleanor Mitchell stood trembling on a hastily constructed platform in the town square, her wrists bound before her with coarse rope. Her father had announced a special auction to the influential men of the region, describing it as an innovative approach to marriage arrangements for his willful but valuable daughter. The pretense was thin, the reality barbaric, yet none had openly objected. Some, like Reverend Thomas, had declined to attend, but many others, business owners, landowners, and even Sheriff Cooper, stood in the crowd, their faces a mixture of discomfort and intrigue. William had started the bidding at $500, an outrageous sum that he clearly expected would limit participation to the wealthiest men present. Edgar Blackwood had immediately offered $600, his thin lips curved in a satisfied smile. To Ellie's horror, Henry Donovan had countered with $700, followed by 2 strangers she didn't recognize, but whose fine clothes marked them as men of means. The bidding had continued, climbing past $900 as Ellie fought to maintain her composure, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She scanned the crowd desperately, searching for any sympathetic face, but found none. Becky and her family were notably absent, likely forbidden from attending by Ellie's father, who would have suspected their loyalty to her. As the bidding reached $1,000, a figure had appeared at the edge of the gathering, tall and imposing, dressed in a curious blend of frontier clothing and traditional Cherokee garments. Thomas Adair observed the proceedings with an expression of barely contained disgust. His sudden presence caused a ripple of unease through the crowd, conversations faltering as attention divided between the auction and the unexpected arrival of the man many whispered about, but few truly knew. Blackwood, unaware or unconcerned about the newcomer, had raised his bid to $1,100. "A small price to pay for such a fine specimen," he'd called out, prompting nervous laughter from some of the onlookers. That was when Thomas Adair had stepped forward, his movements so deliberate that people instinctively cleared a path before him. He'd stopped directly before the platform, his dark eyes meeting Ellie's for a long moment before shifting to William Mitchell. "This is an abomination," he'd stated, his voice carrying easily across the now silent square. "Even by your standards." William had flushed with anger and embarrassment. "This is a private auction, Adair. Your kind isn't welcome here." "My kind?" Thomas had repeated with dangerous softness. "And what kind would that be, Mitchell? The kind that respects women as human beings rather than possessions to be bartered." Several men had shifted uncomfortably, but none spoke up. Blackwood had stepped forward, positioning himself between Thomas and the platform. "Move along, half-breed. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns anyone with a conscience," Thomas had replied, his gaze returning to Ellie. Something in his expression had given her hope, not pity, but recognition of her humanity that had been sorely absent from every other face in that square. Then he'd reached into his coat and withdrawn a leather pouch that landed on the wooden table with a heavy thud. 100 gold pieces, he'd announced. That's more than anyone here can match. The crowd had erupted in astonished murmurs. William had rushed forward, upending the pouch to reveal gleaming coins that represented wealth beyond anything most of the spectators had ever seen in one place. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, suspicion warring with greed on his features. "That's not your concern," Thomas had replied coolly. "Is my bid accepted, or does your prejudice outweigh your avarice?" William had counted the gold rapidly, his hands shaking with excitement despite his obvious discomfort at being outmaneuvered by the Cherokee trader. Finally, he'd looked up, his expression a mixture of reluctance and triumph. "Sold," he'd declared, bringing down his gavel. In that moment, as Thomas Adair had mounted the steps of the platform and untied her bonds, Ellie had expected to feel relief. Instead, a new fear had gripped her. Had she merely exchanged one form of captivity for another? But Thomas had surprised her. After placing his coat around her shoulders, he'd leaned close to whisper words that would forever change her. "Understanding of freedom. You are not property to be owned. You are free to choose your own path." Then he had led her from the platform and through the stunned crowd, his presence alone deterring any who might have considered challenging the outcome of the auction. As they'd passed William Mitchell, Ellie had looked back one final time at the man who had given her life but denied her humanity, seeing him clearly at last, not as the fearsome patriarch of her childhood, but as a small, petty man consumed by his own inadequacies. The realization had been both painful and liberating. In that moment, as she walked away from everything she had ever known toward an uncertain future, Eleanor Mitchell had taken the first step on a journey that would lead her not only to freedom, but to a life richer and more meaningful than she had ever dared to imagine. The road leading away from Pinecrest Valley stretched before Eleanor and Thomas like a promise. Neither spoke as they walked, the weight of what had just transpired hanging between them. Only when the town had disappeared behind the rolling hills did Thomas Adair break the silence. "My cabin is about 5 miles east, near the creek. We can rest there while you decide what you want to do next." His voice was deep but gentle, devoid of the expectation or ownership that Ellie had braced herself to hear. "I don't understand," she said, studying his profile as they walked. "Why would you spend such a fortune to free a stranger?" Thomas was quiet for several paces before answering. "That gold was payment for 5 years of trapping and trading. I was saving it to buy land where neither white men nor Cherokee could question my right to exist." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "I can think of no better use for it than to stop such an injustice." But that was everything you had," Ellie protested, the magnitude of his sacrifice dawning on her. He shrugged, a powerful movement of his broad shoulders. "Gold can be earned again. Freedom, once taken, is harder to restore." They continued in silence as Ellie absorbed his words. The man beside her remained an enigma, part Cherokee, part white, according to Becky, belonging fully to neither world. Perhaps that explained why he had recognized her plight so clearly. He too knew what it meant to be valued, not for who you were, but for what others perceived you to be. The sun was beginning its descent when they reached a small clearing where a sturdy log cabin stood. Unlike the rough frontier shelters Ellie was accustomed to, Thomas's home showed evidence of careful craftsmanship. Split log steps led to a covered porch where dried herbs hung from the rafters. A small corral to one side housed 2 horses that lifted their heads with interest at their approach. "It's not much," Thomas said, watching her take in her surroundings, "but it's peaceful here." "It's beautiful," Ellie replied truthfully. The cabin nestled into the landscape as though it had grown from the earth itself, the surrounding forest creating a natural barrier against the outside world. Inside, the single room was surprisingly comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel adorned with intricately carved wooden figures. Shelves lined another wall, holding books, jars of preserved foods, and bundles of dried plants that filled the air with subtle, earthy fragrance. A bed covered with woven blankets occupied one corner, while a table and 2 chairs stood in another. "You can take the bed," Thomas said, moving to light a fire. "I'll sleep on the porch." "I couldn't displace you from your home," Ellie protested. "You've already done far more than—" "You've had a difficult day," he interrupted gently. "Rest now. Tomorrow is soon enough to make decisions." "What you do?" As Thomas busied himself preparing a simple meal of cornbread and dried venison stew, Ellie found herself studying him more closely. His movements were economical and precise, his presence in the small cabin somehow making it feel more spacious, rather than crowded. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 30, with strong features that spoke of both his Cherokee heritage and his European ancestry. "You have questions," he observed, setting a steaming bowl before her. "Ask them if you wish." Ellie hesitated, then decided on directness. "The townspeople fear you. Why?" A shadow of amusement crossed his face. "People fear what they don't understand. I walk between 2 worlds, belonging to neither. That makes me unpredictable in their eyes." "And are you?" "Dangerous, I mean." Thomas considered this as he took the seat across from her. "I can be," he acknowledged, "when necessary, but I prefer peace to conflict, solitude to company." He gestured to the cabin around them. "Hence this place, away from both settlements. Becky, my friend, mentioned your mother was white." He nodded, a flicker of old pain crossing his features. "She was taken during a raid when she was 16. By the time she was found years later, she had become Cherokee in her heart. She had married, had a son, me. When her white family came to rescue her, she refused to leave." "That must have been difficult for everyone," Ellie said softly. "It was. The white community saw her as tainted, the Cherokee as never truly one of them. She taught me to find strength in belonging to myself, rather than seeking approval from either world." He studied Ellie with those penetrating dark eyes. "Perhaps that's a lesson you understand as well." Ellie dropped her gaze to her barely touched food. "I thought I belonged at Mitchell's Crossing. Even with my father's disappointment, it was the only home I've ever known." "A home should nurture, not diminish," Thomas said quietly. "What your father did today, that was not the action of someone who sees your true worth." Tears threatened, and Ellie fought them back. "I know. I think I've always known. I just never imagined he would go so far." They finished their meal in companionable silence. Afterward, Thomas showed her where to find water for washing and gave her one of his shirts to sleep in, turning his back with respectful discretion as she changed behind a woven privacy screen. "Thank you," she said, as he prepared to leave her for the night. "Not just for today, but for this kindness without expectation." Something in his expression softened. "Rest well, Eleanor Mitchell. Tomorrow you begin your life as a free woman." But freedom proved more complicated than either of them anticipated. Ellie had been asleep for barely 2 hours when urgent knocking jolted her awake. She found Thomas already at the door, a rifle in hand, his posture alert but controlled. "Who's there?" he called, making no move to open the door. "It's Rebecca Williams," came the breathless reply. "Please, Mr. Adair, I need to speak with Ellie." Thomas glanced at Ellie, who nodded quickly. He unbarred the door to reveal Becky, her blonde hair tumbling from its usual neat arrangement, her face flushed from exertion. "Becky, what are you doing here? How did you find us?" Ellie rushed forward to embrace her friend. "Pa showed me the path once," Becky explained between gasps for air. "I rode as fast as I could." "Ellie, you're in danger. Your father has convinced Sheriff Cooper you were kidnapped. They're forming a search party right now. Armed men who've been drinking at Hayes's Tavern all evening." "That's absurd," Ellie protested. "Everyone saw what happened at the auction. Thomas paid my father's price. William's telling anyone who'll listen that Mr. Adair threatened him. Force the sale." Becky's voice dropped. "And Blackwood is adding fuel to the fire, offering a reward for your rescue and Mr. Adair's capture." Thomas's expression had grown grim. "How much time do we have?" "Not much. They were gathering when I slipped away. An hour, maybe less. Then we need to move quickly." Thomas began gathering supplies, his movements efficient despite the urgency. "Eleanor, collect your things. We'll head further into the mountains. I know places they won't find us." Ellie stood frozen, overwhelmed by this sudden turn of events. "This is madness. I'm not a child or a hostage. Surely if I went back and explained—" "They won't listen," Thomas interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "Not with Blackwood's money and your father's pride at stake. The story they're creating is one where I, the savage half-breed, stole you away against your will. The truth doesn't matter." "He's right, Ellie," Becky added, wringing her hands. "The men at the tavern were talking about teaching the Indian a lesson. They're out for blood, not justice." The reality of their situation settled over Ellie like a physical weight. In the span of a single day, she had become a fugitive through no fault of her own. Worse, she had drawn Thomas into danger after he had sacrificed everything to help her. "This is my fault," she whispered. "You should never have intervened." Thomas paused in his preparations to look at her directly. "I made my choice with open eyes, Eleanor. I would make it again." He returned to packing, adding, "Besides, a man who would sell his daughter would find another excuse to come after me eventually. Your father and men like Blackwood have coveted my trading routes for years." Becky clutched Ellie's hands. "I need to get back before they notice I'm gone. Pa will cover for me. But if they suspect I've warned you—" "Go," Ellie urged, embracing her friend tightly. "And thank you for risking so much." "Where will you go?" Becky asked, glancing between them. Thomas shouldered his pack. "Better you don't know, for your safety as much as ours." Within minutes, they had doused the fire and gathered the essentials. Thomas led 2 horses from the corral, helping Ellie mount one before swinging easily onto the other. "The Cherokee settlement?" Ellie asked as they set off into the darkness, the forest closing around them like a protective embrace. Thomas shook his head. "Too obvious. And while many there would shelter me, harboring you would bring trouble. They don't need." He guided his horse alongside a narrow stream, the water masking their tracks. "We'll head deeper into the mountains first, then circle back through territories few white men know." They rode in silence for hours, the moonlight filtering through the trees, providing just enough illumination to navigate the challenging terrain. Thomas led with the confidence of someone who knew every ridge and valley intimately, occasionally, reaching out to steady Ellie when the path grew particularly treacherous. Dawn was breaking when they finally stopped in a secluded hollow sheltered by towering pines. A small spring bubbled from the rocks, providing fresh water. "We'll rest here for a few hours," Thomas said, helping Ellie dismount. Her muscles protested after the long ride, unaccustomed to such exertion. "The horses need it, and so do you." "What about you?" Ellie asked, noting the lines of fatigue etched around his eyes. "I'll keep watch." He unpacked a bedroll and laid it beneath a natural alcove formed by overhanging rocks. "Sleep if you can. We have more ground to cover before nightfall." Exhaustion overwhelmed Ellie's anxiety, and she fell into a deep sleep almost immediately. When she woke, the sun was high overhead. Thomas sat nearby, whittling a piece of wood with practiced movements of his knife. "How long was I asleep?" she asked, sitting up stiffly. A few hours. You needed it. He offered her a water skin and some dried berries. Eat. We should move on soon. As she ate, Ellie studied their surroundings. The hollow was beautiful, untouched by human interference, save for the small traces of previous stays. A ring of stones for a fire, a rough lean-to partially reclaimed by nature. You've been here before, she observed. Thomas nodded. This was one of my father's hunting grounds. He brought me here as a boy. A rare smile softened his features. He taught me that the mountains offer everything needed for survival, if you know how to listen to them. Your father, was he Cherokee? Fully. He was a respected warrior who fell in love with my mother, despite knowing the challenges their union would bring. His hands stilled on his carving. He died defending our village from raiders when I was 15. My mother followed 2 winters later, taken by fever. I'm sorry, Ellie said, the inadequacy of the words weighing on her. My mother died when I was young too. I barely remember her face sometimes, just the feeling of being loved unconditionally. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition of shared loss, of childhood's ending too abruptly. Then Thomas stood, breaking the spell. We should continue. There's a place about half a day's ride from here where we can shelter more permanently. An old trapper's cabin my father and I used to use. As they rode, Ellie found herself drawn into Thomas's world. He pointed out medicinal plants, showed her how to identify animal tracks, and explained how the Cherokee understood the land not as something to be owned, but as a living entity with which they maintained a sacred relationship. His knowledge was both practical and deeply spiritual, revealing a worldview entirely different from the acquisitive perspective that dominated settler society. Your skill with plants, he remarked as she correctly identified a root he used for treating fever. Where did you learn that? My mother started teaching me, and after she died, I taught myself, Ellie explained. Dr. Grant in town would let me read his medical books when I brought him specimens. He's been training me, unofficially of course. A healer, Thomas said with approval, a valuable gift. Ellie shook her head. My father called it a waste of time. Women's foolishness, he'd say. Yet another way he failed to see your true worth. Thomas's voice held no judgment, merely stating what he perceived as fact. They reached the trapper's cabin as dusk settled over the mountains. Unlike Thomas's home, this structure was cruder, clearly built for functionality rather than comfort. Still, its walls were sound, and the stone fireplace would provide warmth against the mountain chill. We should be safe here for a time, Thomas said as he unloaded their supplies. Few know of this place, and those who do would have no reason to connect it to me. How long do we stay? Ellie asked, the reality of their situation settling over her anew. Thomas paused. That depends on you, Eleanor. What do you want to do? The question caught her off guard. All her life, others had dictated her path, her father most of all. Now, faced with genuine choice, she found herself momentarily at a loss. I don't know, she admitted. I never planned beyond escaping my father's arrangement with Blackwood. Then we have time to consider options. Thomas spoke matter-of-factly, as though they were discussing something as mundane as weather rather than the course of her life. The search will eventually lose momentum. Men like Cooper and your father have limited patience and other concerns to attend to. And Blackwood? A shadow crossed Thomas's face. Blackwood is more persistent, but even he can't search these mountains forever. That night, as they sat beside a small fire inside the cabin, Ellie found herself studying the man who had so drastically altered her fate. In the dancing firelight, the planes of his face seemed carved from copper, his eyes reflecting depths she couldn't begin to fathom. Why do you live alone? She asked suddenly. Between worlds, as you put it. Thomas added another small branch to the fire before answering. After my parents died, I tried living fully in each world. Among the Cherokee, I was always the son of the white woman, respected for my father's standing, but never fully accepted. Among the settlers, I was just another savage, tolerated for my skills, but watched with suspicion. He leaned back against the wall, stretching his long legs before him. Eventually, I realized that trying to belong was causing me more pain than the solitude of charting my own path. I built my cabin, established my trading routes, and found peace in self-reliance. "Doesn't it get lonely?" Ellie asked softly. "Sometimes," he acknowledged, "but there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. I have connections, Cherokee friends who respect my skills, settlers who value my fair trading. I visit the settlements when necessary, then return to my solitude. And family. Did you never want to marry, have children?" A complex emotion flickered across his features. "Cherokee women want full-blooded children to strengthen the tribe. White women..." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Well, you've seen how your people view mine. What decent white family would welcome me as a son-in-law?" "Not all white people share those prejudices," Ellie objected. "No," he conceded, "but enough do to make such a union difficult at best, dangerous at worst." He studied her with sudden intensity. "Why these questions, Eleanor Mitchell?" Ellie felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm just trying to understand the man who gave up everything to help me." "Not everything," Thomas corrected gently. "Just gold, and gold is merely metal unless it purchases something of true value." The days that followed established a rhythm unlike anything Ellie had previously known. They rose with the sun, Thomas teaching her the skills needed to survive in the wilderness, how to move silently through the forest, how to set snares for small game, how to read weather patterns in the sky. In return, she shared her knowledge of medicinal plants, expanding his already considerable understanding with techniques she had learned from Dr. Grant. Their initial wariness gave way to genuine companionship. Thomas, once so taciturn, revealed a dry wit that often caught Ellie by surprise, drawing unexpected laughter from her. She, in turn, found herself sharing stories of her childhood, memories both bitter and sweet that she had locked away for years. A week passed, then two. They ventured cautiously to a Cherokee trading post where Thomas had friends, exchanging pelts for supplies they couldn't procure themselves. The Cherokee woman who managed the post, Ayita, clearly had known Thomas. For years, her easy familiarity with him revealing a depth of connection Ellie hadn't anticipated. "You bring trouble with you this time, River Wolf," Ayita remarked in English, her shrewd eyes taking in Ellie's presence. "Trouble found me," Thomas replied with a shrug. "Has there been talk?" Ayita nodded. "White men came through 3 days ago, asking questions, making threats. They offer money for the white woman and for you, dead or alive." Ellie felt the blood drain from her face. Thomas's expression remained impassive, but she saw his jaw tighten. "Did they say who sent them?" "A man named Blackwood. He stays at the trading post near the settlement, sending others to do his searching." Ayita's gaze shifted to Ellie. "They say you stole her." "He saved me," Ellie corrected firmly. "My father tried to sell me like property. Thomas paid the price and set me free." Ayita studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I see the truth in your eyes." She turned back to Thomas, switching to Cherokee and speaking rapidly. Ellie couldn't understand the words, but the urgency was clear. Thomas replied in the same language, his tone measured but serious. Finally, Ayita reached beneath the counter and pressed something into his hand. A small leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. "Take it," she insisted, when he tried to refuse. "You will need it before this is done." They left with their supplies, and Ayita's warning ringing in their ears. The search was not diminishing, but intensifying. Blackwood had apparently convinced the territorial authorities that Thomas had kidnapped Ellie, adding charges of theft and assault to further inflame the situation. "He won't stop, will he?" Ellie asked as they rode back toward their temporary sanctuary, the weight of their predicament pressing down on her. "This isn't just about me anymore." "It never was," Thomas replied grimly. "Blackwood has wanted control of the trading routes through Cherokee territory for years. This gives him the perfect excuse to eliminate me as competition while reclaiming his property, you. We can't keep hiding forever." "No," Thomas agreed. "Sooner or later they'll find the cabin. We need a more permanent solution." That night, as they discussed options over a meager supper, Ellie made a decision. "I could go back," she suggested. "Explain that I went willingly, that there was no kidnapping." Thomas shook his head. "They won't believe you, or worse, they'll claim I've corrupted or threatened you into lying. Then what? Keep running? Leave the territory entirely?" "That might be safest," he acknowledged. "I have contacts further west. We could make a fresh start where Blackwood's influence doesn't reach." The implication of his words hung between them. We, a future together, far from the prejudices and dangers they faced here. The prospect stirred emotions in Ellie that both exhilarated and terrified her. "You would leave your home for me?" Thomas's dark eyes held hers steadily. "Home is not a place, Eleanor. It's a feeling of belonging, of peace." He hesitated, then added quietly, "These past weeks, I felt more at home than I have in years." The confession, simple yet profound, sent warmth spreading through Ellie's chest. Before she could respond, however, the distant sound of a snapping twig froze them both in place. Thomas extinguished their small lamp with one swift movement, plunging the cabin into darkness, broken only by the dying embers of the fire. "Stay here," he whispered, reaching for his rifle. "If I don't return in 10 minutes, take the back trail we scouted, ride for Ayita's. She'll help you." "Thomas, no!" But he was already at the door, slipping into the night like a shadow. Ellie counted the seconds in her pounding heartbeat, straining to hear any sound from outside. 5 minutes passed. 10. Just as she was preparing to follow Thomas's instructions, the cabin door eased open. "It's clear," Thomas said softly, returning to her side. "A deer, nothing more. But we should move on at first light. This place isn't secure enough." Relief flooded through Ellie, followed by the sudden, overwhelming realization of how devastated she would have been had Thomas not returned. In that moment of clarity, she understood that her feelings for him had grown far beyond gratitude or dependency. Somewhere in these weeks of shared danger and quiet companionship, she had begun to love this solitary man who had risked everything for a stranger's freedom. The recognition must have shown on her face, for Thomas stilled, studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, he reached out to touch her cheek with calloused fingers. "Eleanor," he began, his voice rough with emotion. Outside, a twig snapped again, louder this time, deliberately broken. Then another, and another, the unmistakable sound of multiple individuals surrounding the cabin. "Thomas Adair!" A voice called out, Sheriff Cooper, his usual affable tone hardened into authority. "We know you're in there. Come out with the girl, and no one needs to get hurt." Thomas moved with practiced precision, his body tense, but his mind clear. "Back door," he whispered to Eleanor, pressing his rifle into her hands. "Remember the path we discussed." "I won't leave you," she insisted, clutching the weapon. "This isn't a debate." His voice remained low but carried unmistakable authority. "They want me more than they want you. I'll buy you time." Before, Eleanor could protest further. Lantern light flickered through the cabin's single window, casting elongated shadows across the rough-hewn floor. Thomas pressed a small leather pouch into her palm, Aita's coins, then guided her toward the narrow, back exit, concealed behind a crude storage shelf. "Thomas Adair," Sheriff Cooper called again, his patience wearing thin. "You have until the count of 10. Thomas touched Eleanor's cheek one final time, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. "Live free," he murmured, the words carrying the weight of a sacred vow. Then he turned toward the front door, squaring his shoulders as Sheriff Cooper began his count. Eleanor hesitated at the hidden exit, torn between escape and loyalty. In the mere weeks she'd known Thomas, he had shown her more respect and genuine care than she'd experienced in 20 years with her own father. The thought of abandoning him to face Blackwood's justice made her physically ill. 5, 6. Cooper's counting continued, punctuated by the metallic sound of firearms being readied. Thomas glanced back, his dark eyes meeting hers with silent, pleading. "Go," they said. "Live." 7, 8. Eleanor made her decision. Instead of slipping through the back exit, she moved to Thomas's side, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. His eyes widened in disbelief and something like anger, but there was no time for discussion. 9! "We're coming out!" Eleanor called, her voice steadier than she felt. "We're unarmed! Don't shoot!" She placed the rifle on the table, ignoring Thomas's look of dismay. Then, before he could stop her, she took his hand in hers and pushed open the cabin door. The clearing outside blazed with lantern light. Sheriff Cooper stood at the forefront of at least 15 men, most of whom Eleanor recognized from Pinecrest Valley. Armed with rifles and expressions ranging from nervous determination to outright hostility, they formed a semicircle around the cabin entrance. Behind Cooper stood Edgar Blackwood, satisfaction etched across his aristocratic features, and beside him, looking somehow both triumphant and diminished, stood William Mitchell. "Eleanor," her father called, stepping forward. "Thank God you're alive. Has he hurt you?" The concern in his voice sounded rehearsed, as if he'd practiced the line repeatedly on the ride up. Eleanor maintained her grip on Thomas's hand, drawing strength from his solid presence beside her. "The only person who has hurt me is you, father," she replied clearly, "when you tried to sell me like cattle." Murmurs rippled through the assembled men. Not everyone had witnessed the auction, it seemed, and Blackwood had likely spun a different tale to recruit his search party. "The girl is confused," Blackwood interjected smoothly, obviously suffering from her ordeal with this savage. His cold gaze fixed on Thomas with undisguised contempt. "I am not confused," Eleanor countered, her voice rising with indignation. "Everyone in town saw what happened. My father arranged an auction where I was the merchandise. Mr. Blackwood bid on me as if I were property, and when Thomas Adair outbid them all, he freed me instead of claiming ownership." Another wave of murmurs, more uncertain this time. Cooper shifted uncomfortably, his rifle lowering slightly. "That's not how the law sees it," William said, his face flushing with anger or embarrassment, perhaps both. "You're my daughter under my authority until married. This man had no right to interfere in family matters." "Family matters?" Eleanor echoed incredulously. "Is that what you call selling your own child?" "Enough of this nonsense," Blackwood snapped, his genial mask slipping to reveal the ruthlessness beneath. He turned to Cooper. "Sheriff, arrest this man for kidnapping, theft, and interference with lawful commerce." Cooper hesitated, glancing between Blackwood and Eleanor. The delay was brief, but telling. Cooper's conscience was not entirely silenced by Blackwood's influence. Thomas, who had remained silent through this exchange, finally spoke. "I paid fair price at an open auction," he stated evenly. By your own laws, the transaction was legal. Eleanor Mitchell is free to choose her own path. No such law recognizes the sale of white women to Indians, Blackwood retorted. The entire proceeding was invalid. Then return my gold, Thomas challenged, his voice carrying across the clearing. 100 pieces paid in full view of witnesses. William Mitchell's expression tightened. Everyone present knew that gold was long gone, likely divided between Mitchell's creditors and his own vices. The gold was payment for damages, William blustered, for the dishonor you brought upon my family by absconding with my daughter. Thomas's quiet laugh held no humor. Your dishonor was complete before I ever arrived, Mitchell. You cannot sell what was never yours to sell. Not her body, not her spirit, not her future. The philosophical truth of his statement was lost on the assembled men, most of whom grew increasingly uncomfortable with the moral complexity unfolding before them. They had expected a straightforward rescue mission: capture the Indian kidnapper, retrieve the white woman, return to their normal lives with a story to tell at Hayes's Tavern. Instead, they found themselves witnesses to a dispute that challenged the very foundations of their social order. Cooper, recognizing the deteriorating situation, attempted to reassert control. Regardless of the circumstances, the fact remains that Miss Mitchell needs to return home, and Mr. Adair needs to answer some questions. He gestured toward one of his deputies. Jenkins, escort Miss Mitchell to her father. No. Eleanor's refusal was quiet, but implacable. I won't return to a man who values me only for what I can be sold for. Eleanor, you're being ridiculous, William said, his patience visibly fraying. You belong at home, with your family, with people of your own kind. My own kind? She raised her chin defiantly. My own kind would never treat another human being as property. My own kind would recognize my right to determine my own future. Thomas squeezed her hand in silent support, a gesture not lost on Blackwood, whose expression darkened dangerously. This has gone on long enough, he declared, producing a document from inside his coat. I have here an order from Judge Harrington authorizing the immediate return of Eleanor Mitchell to her father's custody and the arrest of Thomas Adair on multiple charges. He thrust the paper toward Cooper. Execute your duty, Sheriff. Cooper examined the document, his weathered face betraying nothing. Finally, he nodded to his deputies. Jenkins, Fletcher, secure Mr. Adair. Williams, escort Miss Mitchell to her father. The men moved forward, expressions grim but determined. Thomas released Eleanor's hand and stepped slightly forward, placing himself between her and the approaching deputies. She goes of her own free will or not at all, he stated, his voice low but carrying the unmistakable promise of resistance. The clearing grew silent, tension crackling like lightning before a storm. Every man present recognized the precipice they stood upon. One wrong move, one hasty action, and blood would stain the mountain soil. Stop! A new voice cut through the standoff, causing heads to turn in surprise. Dr. Samuel Grant pushed through the gathered men, his normally neat appearance disheveled from hard riding. Behind him came Becky Williams and her father, along with Martha Hayes from the tavern, and, most surprisingly, Reverend Thorne from the Pinecrest Church. What is the meaning of this interruption? Blackwood demanded, visibly annoyed by the newcomers. The meaning, Mr. Blackwood, Dr. Grant replied, slightly breathless, is that we will not stand by while injustice is perpetrated in the name of law. He turned to Cooper. Sheriff, that document in your hand is based on false testimony. Judge Harrington was not informed of the full circumstances. William Mitchell started forward angrily. This doesn't concern you, Grant. Stay out of family business. It concerns the entire community when one of our own is treated as chattel, Grant retorted, his normally mild demeanor hardened into righteous indignation. He approached Eleanor, his medical instincts automatically assessing her condition. "Are you well, child? Has anyone harmed you?" "I'm fine, Dr. Grant," Eleanor assured him, emotion catching in her throat at the unexpected appearance of allies. "Thomas has been nothing but honorable." Grant nodded, then turned to address the gathered men. "I have here sworn affidavits from 8 witnesses to the auction where William Mitchell sold his daughter to the highest bidder." He produced a sheaf of papers from his satchel. "Martha Hayes, owner of the tavern where Mitchell arranged this disgrace. Henry Donovan, who participated in the bidding. Reverend Thorne, who witnessed the proceedings while attempting to intervene." The Reverend stepped forward, his austere features solemn. "What I saw that day violated both God's law and man's," he stated firmly. "A father betrayed his sacred duty to protect his child. The only person who acted with honor was Mr. Adair, who used his wealth not to possess, but to liberate." A ripple of unease passed through the search party. Cooper read through the affidavits, his frown deepening with each page. "Furthermore," Grant continued, "Judge Harrington was not informed that Thomas Adair paid in full for what was presented as a legitimate transaction. Nor was he told that Eleanor left willingly, without coercion or deception." Blackwood's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "This is preposterous," he sputtered. "You expect us to believe this Indian acted from pure altruism? That he spent a fortune to free a woman he had no designs upon? The very suggestion is absurd." "Not absurd," Martha Hayes interjected, her shrewd gaze moving between Eleanor and Thomas. "Just uncommon, like finding honor where least expected or corruption where most trusted." Her pointed glance toward Blackwood and Mitchell left no doubt about her meaning. Cooper had finished reading the affidavits. His expression, when he looked up, had shifted from duty-bound determination to troubled uncertainty. "These statements directly contradict the testimony that led to Judge Harrington's order," he said slowly. "Of course they do," Blackwood snapped. "Grant has obviously coerced these signatures from gullible townspeople. The legal document in your hand supersedes any random collection of statements." "Actually," Grant countered, "Judge Harrington specifically instructed me to inform you that if contrary evidence emerged, you were to suspend execution of his order until a proper hearing could be arranged." Cooper's gaze sharpened. "You spoke with the judge?" "Yesterday morning, when these affidavits were collected. He was most disturbed to learn that his court might have been used to further a personal vendetta." Blackwood's composure cracked. "Further, this is outrageous. Mitchell, are you going to stand there while your daughter is stolen from you by this Indian and his coterie of sympathizers?" William Mitchell had been strangely silent during the exchange, his gaze fixed on his daughter, with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite decipher. Now, confronted by Blackwood's demand, he seemed to age before their eyes, shoulders slumping beneath the weight of public judgment. "She's not being stolen," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "She was sold by me." He looked around. The clearing, meeting the eyes of men he'd called neighbors and drinking companions for decades. "I sold my own daughter because I was desperate and drunk and foolish." His gaze returned to Eleanor, something like genuine remorse flickering in his eyes. "I've been a poor excuse for a father, too focused on what I didn't have to appreciate, what I did." The confession, unexpected and obviously painful, created a moment of stunned silence. Even Blackwood seemed temporarily at a loss for words. Eleanor stared at her father, conflicting emotions warring within her chest. For years, she had longed for some acknowledgement of her worth, some recognition of her existence beyond her usefulness. Now, hearing him admit his failings before the assembled community, she felt neither triumph nor satisfaction, only a profound sadness for what might have been. "It's too late, Father," she said softly. "Too much has happened." William nodded, accepting her judgment with uncharacteristic dignity. Then, squaring his shoulders, he turned to Cooper. "Sheriff, I'm withdrawing my complaint. My daughter is of age to make her own decisions. If she chooses to stay with Adair, that's her right." Blackwood erupted in fury. "You spineless fool! After everything I've done for you, the debts I've covered, the position I've offered," he rounded on Cooper. "This changes nothing. The charges of theft and assault remain." Adair still took property that wasn't his to take. "The gold was freely given as payment," Thomas pointed out calmly, "as these affidavits confirm. "Not the gold," Blackwood snarled. "My property rights to the Mitchell farm, and, by extension, everything on it, including her." He jabbed a finger toward Eleanor. "Mitchell signed over full ownership the day before the auction. She was legally mine already." The revelation struck Eleanor like a physical blow. Her father had sold not just her future, but their entire heritage. The land her mother had loved, the home that contained her few precious memories, all to this cruel, calculating man. William Mitchell's face drained of color. "That's a lie," he stammered. "I signed an option for future purchase, not a transfer of ownership." Blackwood's thin lips curved in a cold smile. "Read the document more carefully next time, Mitchell, perhaps when you're sober." He turned back to Cooper. "The facts remain. Adair interfered with my lawful property and must be held accountable." Cooper looked increasingly uncomfortable with the direction events had taken. "Mr. Blackwood, if what you say is true, that's a matter for civil court, not criminal charges. I can't arrest a man based on a contract dispute." "Can't or won't?" Blackwood's voice dropped dangerously. "Remember who finances your office, Cooper. Remember who ensures your re-election. This is bigger than one insignificant girl or one troublesome half-breed. This is about maintaining order, about showing everyone in this territory who holds real power." The naked threat hung in the air, revealing more than Blackwood had perhaps intended about the true nature of his interest in Pinecrest Valley. He wanted not just land or wealth, but control, absolute authority over both resources and people. Cooper's weathered face hardened as he made his decision. "I uphold the law, Mr. Blackwood, not your personal interests." He folded Judge Harrington's order and tucked it into his coat. "Based on these conflicting accounts, I'm suspending all actions until a proper hearing can be arranged in town. Miss Mitchell will remain free to choose her residence in the meantime. Mr. Adair will retain his liberty unless new evidence emerges." Blackwood's composure shattered completely. "You'll regret this defiance, Cooper. All of you will." His cold gaze swept the clearing, lingering on Eleanor and Thomas. "Especially you two. This isn't over, not by a long measure." He turned to the men he had brought with him. $15 to any man who brings me Adair's head. 30 for bringing me the girl unharmed. The offer, so blatantly illegal, in the presence of the sheriff, shocked even those who had been sympathetic to Blackwood's cause. Cooper's hand moved to his sidearm. "That's enough, Blackwood. You're leaving now, before I arrest you for inciting violence." For a tense moment, it seemed Blackwood might challenge the sheriff directly. Then, with a final venomous glare toward Eleanor and Thomas, he stalked toward his horse. "Mitchell, are you coming or staying with these traitors?" William Mitchell looked at his daughter one last time, a lifetime of regret evident in his weary eyes. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," he said simply. Then he turned and followed Blackwood into the darkness. The atmosphere in the clearing lightened perceptibly with their departure, though tensions still lingered. Cooper dispatched most of his men to escort Blackwood back to town, retaining only 2 deputies. "I meant what I said," he told Eleanor. "And Thomas, you're free for now, but this matter isn't settled. Be at the courthouse next Tuesday for a formal hearing." He tipped his hat to Eleanor. "Miss Mitchell, I hope you know what you're doing." "For the first time in my life, Sheriff," she replied steadily, "I believe I do." As Cooper and his Remaining men prepared to depart, Dr. Grant approached Thomas and Eleanor. "You shouldn't stay here," he advised quietly. "Blackwood won't give up so easily. He has too much at stake." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked. "The railroad," Becky's father, Robert Williams, explained, joining their conversation. "That's what this is really about. The new line is coming through these mountains, and whoever controls the right-of-way stands to make a fortune." "My land," Thomas realized, understanding dawning. "The most direct route would cross through my property and the nearby Cherokee holdings." Williams nodded. "Blackwood's been buying up every parcel he can get his hands on. Your father's farm was just one piece of a larger puzzle, Eleanor. But your land," he turned to Thomas, "that's the key piece he's missing." "So this was never about me at all," Eleanor said, a mixture of relief and indignation coloring her voice. "Oh, I think it became about you," Martha Hayes interjected with surprising insight. "Men like Blackwood can't stand being denied what they want, be it land, money, or a woman. You became a symbol of his thwarted ambition." She glanced at Thomas. "And you became his perfect scapegoat, the savage he could blame when things went wrong." Thomas absorbed this information with the quiet stoicism Eleanor had come to admire. "Where would you suggest we go?" he asked Grant. The doctor exchanged glances with Reverend Thorne. "My brother has a place near the Kentucky border," the Reverend offered. "It's a 3-day ride, but you'd be beyond Blackwood's immediate reach. I can provide a letter of introduction." "And I can supply medicines and provisions," Grant added. "You should leave tonight while Blackwood is occupied with Cooper." As their unexpected allies helped them prepare for departure, Eleanor found herself overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of their fortunes. Just an hour ago, she had expected Thomas to be arrested and herself returned to a life of subservience. Now they had a chance at escape, at freedom, perhaps even a future together. "Why are you helping us?" she asked Becky as her friend packed food supplies into saddlebags. "You're risking Blackwood's anger." Becky smiled, her honest face reflecting simple conviction. "Because it's right, Ellie. What your father did was wrong. What Blackwood's trying to do is worse." She lowered her voice. "Besides, I've seen how you look at Mr. Adair and how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching." Heat rose to Eleanor's cheeks. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Becky squeezed her hand. "It's the way my ma looks at my pa, even after 20 years together, like he hung the moon and stars just for her." Before Eleanor could respond, Thomas approached, leading 2 fresh horses provided by Williams. "We're ready," he said, his gaze lingering on Eleanor's flushed face. "If you still want to come with me." The question contained layers of meaning beyond their immediate circumstances. He was offering her a true choice, freedom to decide her own path, even if that path led away from him. Eleanor's answer came without hesitation. "I do." Their small group of allies gathered to bid them farewell. "Be careful," Grant warned. "Blackwood has connections beyond Pinecrest Valley. Keep moving until you reach Thorne's brother." "And after the hearing?" Eleanor asked. "What then?" The doctor's expression grew grave. "Much depends on Judge Harrington. He's a fair man, but even he is subject to influence. And Blackwood has plenty to exert." Thomas helped Eleanor mount her horse, his strong hands steady at her waist. "We'll face that challenge when it comes," he said, swinging effortlessly onto his own mount. "For now, we focus on reaching safety." With final words of gratitude to their supporters, they rode into the forest, leaving the cabin and the confrontation behind. The moon had risen, providing just enough light to navigate the narrow trail. Thomas led the way, his knowledge of the mountain paths once again proving invaluable. They rode in companionable silence for nearly an hour, putting distance between themselves and potential pursuit. Eleanor's mind raced with the evening's revelations. Her father's belated admission, Blackwood's true motives, the unexpected support from townspeople she'd never considered allies. "You're quiet," Thomas observed as they paused to rest the horses beside a small stream. "I'm processing," she replied, accepting his hand as she dismounted. "Everything happened so quickly." Thomas nodded, unsaddling their mounts to allow them a more comfortable rest. "Your father surprised me," he admitted. "I didn't expect him to acknowledge his wrongdoing." "Nor I," Eleanor said softly. "Too little, too late. But still, I never thought he'd admit fault before others. Perhaps he cares for you more than his actions have shown." Thomas spread a blanket on a flat rock beside the stream, gesturing for her to sit. "People are seldom all good or all bad, even William Mitchell." Eleanor settled beside him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "Do you think Blackwood will follow through on his threat?" "Yes." Thomas's response held no hesitation. "He's a man who believes wealth entitles him to whatever he desires. Being defied publicly by Cooper, by you, by me, that wounds his pride in ways he won't forgive." "Oh. Then we keep running? For how long?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the moonlit stream. "That depends on you, Eleanor, on what kind of life you want." "What are my options?" she asked, genuinely curious about how he viewed their situation. "We reach Reverend Thorne's brother in Kentucky. You could stay there, build a new life in a place where Blackwood's influence doesn't reach." He hesitated, then added, "Or we could continue northwest into territories where neither of us would carry the burdens of our pasts." "Together?" The question escaped before she could contain it. Thomas turned to face her, moonlight illuminating the strong planes of his face. "If that's what you want," he said carefully, "but don't feel obligated because of what I've done. Your freedom means choosing your own path, even if that path doesn't include me." Eleanor studied him in the silvery light, this man who had sacrificed everything to give her choices when everyone else had sought to limit them. In the short time she had known him, Thomas Adair had shown her more respect, more genuine regard for her thoughts and abilities than any other person in her life. "And if I choose a path that does include you?" she asked softly. "What then?" Something shifted in his dark eyes, hope mingled with uncertainty. "Then we face whatever comes together," he answered, his deep voice barely above a whisper. "But, Eleanor, you should consider carefully. Life with me wouldn't be easy. I belong nowhere and everywhere. The world sees me as neither white nor Cherokee, but something in between. You would share that burden." "I already share it," she pointed out. "The moment you outbid Blackwood at that auction, our fates became intertwined in the eyes of Pinecrest Valley. Whatever happens next, I'm already part of your story." Thomas reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. The gentle touch sent warmth cascading through her. "And what story do you want us to write?" he asked, under the vast canopy of stars, with the melody of the stream providing nature's perfect accompaniment. Eleanor made her choice. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, the kiss conveying what words could, not trust, gratitude, and the first blooming of love. When they separated, Thomas's expression held wonder, as though he had never expected such a gift. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "More certain than I've ever been about anything," Eleanor replied. "You gave me freedom. Now I'm choosing how to use it." Their second kiss deepened, a promise exchanged without words. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Blackwood's vengeance, the upcoming hearing, the uncertain future in new territories, they would face them together. two souls who had found in each other what society had denied them both: unconditional acceptance and the courage to forge their own path. Dawn was approaching when they reluctantly resumed their journey. The 3-day ride to Kentucky would test their endurance and vigilance, but Eleanor felt a strange sense of peace despite the dangers that surely pursued them. For the first time in her life, she was moving towards something of her own choosing, rather than away from circumstances imposed by others. As they crested a ridge, the valleys below still draped in pre-dawn mist, Thomas pointed eastward. "The sun comes," he said simply, "a new day." Eleanor took his free hand in hers, intertwining their fingers. "A new beginning," she corrected, her heart filled with a hope she had never dared to embrace before this moment. Together, they rode toward the awakening light, leaving the shadows of their pasts behind them, not forgotten, but no longer defining the boundaries of their future. The journey toward Kentucky demanded every ounce of Thomas's wilderness expertise. Rather than following established trails where Blackwood's men might lay in ambush, they traversed ridgelines and valleys seldom visited by settlers, camping in well-concealed locations and moving mainly at night and dawn. Eleanor's riding skills improved daily out of necessity, as did her endurance for the grueling pace Thomas set. "How much farther?" she asked on the morning of the 3rd day, massaging her sore muscles as they broke camp before sunrise. Thomas studied the distant mountains, their peaks catching the first golden rays of daylight. "If we push hard, we can reach the Kentucky border by nightfall. Reverend Thorne's brother lives in a settlement about 10 miles beyond." "And you're certain he'll take us in?" Doubt crept into Eleanor's voice. The farther they traveled from Pinecrest Valley, the more she recognized how precarious their situation remained. 2 fugitives with limited resources, one of them a mixed-blood Cherokee, unwelcome in most white settlements. Thomas secured there, packs on the horses with practiced efficiency. Thorne's letter should ensure us sanctuary, at least temporarily. His brother apparently shares his more progressive views on race and justice. Eleanor caught the subtle reservation in his voice. "But you're still concerned." He straightened, meeting her gaze directly. "I've learned to be cautious with strangers, regardless of their reputed kindness. People's principles often falter when tested by reality." "You mean when faced with a real Cherokee, rather than an abstract ideal of brotherhood," Eleanor surmised. Thomas's smile held a hint of sadness. "Precisely. It's easier to espouse tolerance from a distance than to welcome it into your home." They mounted up and continued their journey, the terrain gradually shifting from the steep, pine-covered slopes of the Tennessee mountains to the gentler, more open landscape of the Kentucky borderlands. The change brought both advantages and risks: easier travel, but less cover from potential pursuers. By midday, a new concern arose. Dark clouds massed on the western horizon, and the air took on the electric tension that preceded a serious storm. Thomas studied the approaching weather with growing unease. "We need to find shelter," he decided. "That storm will hit within hours, and we're too exposed here." "Is there a cave or cabin nearby?" Eleanor asked, eyeing the ominous clouds. "Nothing I'm familiar with. We've left my usual hunting territories." He scanned the landscape, then pointed toward a distant curl of smoke rising from the valley below. "There's a homestead. We may have to risk approaching it." Eleanor understood his reluctance. A lone Cherokee man and a white woman riding together would raise immediate suspicion among most frontier families, particularly in unfamiliar territory where Thomas's reputation didn't precede him. "Let me approach alone," she suggested. "I can explain we're travelers caught by the storm. Nothing more." Thomas shook his head firmly. "We stay together. If there's trouble, we face it together." The homestead proved to be a modest but well-maintained farm with a main cabin, barn, and several outbuildings. As they approached, a man emerged from the barn, rifle in hand but not raised. He watched their approach with wary attention. "That's far enough," he called when they were within earshot. "State your business." Thomas halted their horses at a respectful distance. "We're travelers bound for the settlement beyond the border. The storm caught us by surprise. We're seeking shelter until it passes." The farmer, a weathered man in his 40s with a sun-browned face and calloused hands, studied them intently, his gaze lingering on Thomas's distinctive features and their obvious differences. "You husband and wife?" he asked bluntly. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, but answered before Thomas could. "We are traveling companions with mutual respect for each other. The details of our relationship are our own affair." Something like approval flickered in the farmer's eyes. "Fair enough. Name's Daniel Carson." He lowered his rifle slightly. "And you are?" "I'm Eleanor Mitchell. This is Thomas Adair." Carson's posture stiffened at Thomas's name. "The trader from the Cherokee territories." Thomas nodded cautiously, his body tensing almost imperceptibly beside Eleanor. "You've heard of me, heard you're fair in your dealings, heard you know these mountains better than most white men born here." Carson seemed to come to a decision. "Storm's moving fast. You can shelter in the barn. My wife will bring food when it's ready." It wasn't the warmest welcome, but it was more than either of them had expected. As they stabled their horses in the spacious barn, Eleanor noted Thomas's continued vigilance. "You don't trust his hospitality?" she asked quietly. "I'm reserving judgment," Thomas replied. He recognized my name too quickly for someone this far from my usual trading routes. His caution proved justified when Carson returned an hour later, accompanied by his wife, a slender woman with kind eyes that contrasted with her husband's stern demeanor, and another man whose formal attire marked him as no farmer. "This here's Mr. Harlow," Carson introduced him. "He was passing through when the storm hit. Thought you might want to make his acquaintance." The newcomer stepped forward, extending his hand first to Eleanor with unexpected courtesy, then to Thomas without hesitation. "James Harlow, at your service. I represent the Cumberland Railroad Company." Thomas accepted the handshake with measured politeness, though Eleanor sensed his heightened alertness. "What brings a railroad man to these remote parts, Mr. Harlow?" Harlow smiled, revealing a gold tooth among otherwise perfect white teeth. "Surveying potential routes, of course. The future of commerce lies in connecting these isolated communities to the broader markets." He studied Thomas with undisguised interest. "Your name is known in certain circles, Mr. Adair. Your knowledge of the mountain passages between Tennessee and Kentucky would be invaluable to our planning." Mrs. Carson set down a tray of coffee and cornbread. "Supper will be ready in an hour. You're welcome to join us in the house." "Thank you for your kindness," Eleanor replied, genuinely touched by the woman's gentle hospitality, despite the obvious curiosity that surrounded their unusual traveling arrangement. When the Carsons departed, leaving them alone with Harlow, the railroad man's demeanor shifted subtly, less formal, more direct. "I'll be frank, Mr. Adair. My company has been attempting to secure a viable route through the mountains for over a year. The terrain is challenging, and the existing surveys are incomplete at best, misleading at worst." "And how does this concern us?" Thomas asked, his voice neutral. "Directly, in fact. We've encountered significant resistance from a competitor, Eastern Valley Railroad, represented by a Mr. Edgar Blackwood." Eleanor stiffened at the name, earning a sharp glance from Harlow. "Ah, I see the name is familiar to you," he noted. "Then perhaps you're also aware that Blackwood's methods are less than ethical. He's been systematically acquiring properties along potential routes, sometimes through legitimate purchases, often through coercion or deception. We've had experiences with Mr. Blackwood's business practices," Thomas acknowledged carefully. Harlow nodded. "I suspected as much when Carson mentioned your names. You see, Blackwood has been quite vocal about certain obstacles to his plans, specifically a mixed-blood Cherokee trader with extensive land holdings and a young woman who has interfered with his property acquisitions." "How did you know we'd be here?" Eleanor asked, suspicion edging her voice. "I didn't," Harlow assured her. "My presence is genuine coincidence, or providence if you prefer. I've been meeting with landowners throughout this region for weeks. The storm drove me to Carson's hospitality just hours before you arrived." Thomas remained skeptical. "And what exactly do you want from us, Mr. Harlow?" "An alliance of mutual benefit." Harlow leaned forward earnestly. Blackwood's influence with local authorities gives him advantages in Tennessee, but his reach diminishes across the Kentucky border. My company can offer protection from his vendettas, legal representation, witnesses to counter his false claims, even armed guards if necessary. "In exchange for what?" Thomas asked, though Eleanor suspected he already knew the answer. "Access to your land for a railroad right-of-way, naturally, and your expertise in mapping the most efficient route through the mountain passes." Harlow smiled. "At very generous compensation, I assure you." The proposition hung between them, tempting in its practical benefits yet fraught with implications neither could fully assess. Before they could respond, the barn door swung open, admitting not Carson but a young boy of about 12, breathless with excitement. "Pa sent me to warn you," he blurted. "Riders coming up the valley road. 6 men, moving fast despite the storm." Thomas was on his feet instantly. "Blackwood's men?" The boy shrugged. "Don't know, but Pa says they're armed and look like trouble. He says to tell you there's a trail behind the barn that leads to the ridge. If you go now, they won't see you leave." Harlow moved to the barn door, peering out at the approaching storm. "Go. I'll delay them if they're who we suspect. Carson will claim he hasn't seen you." "Why would you help us?" Eleanor asked, even as Thomas quickly prepared their horses. "Because Blackwood is the worst kind of opportunist, the kind who believes money entitles him to bypass both law and basic human decency." Harlow's expression hardened. "And because I despise men who use power to crush those they perceive as beneath them." Within minutes they were mounted and slipping through the back of the barn as the first heavy raindrops struck the roof. The boy led them to a narrow trail barely visible among the trees and dense undergrowth. "Follow this to the top of the ridge," he instructed. "It joins up with the old hunting path that crosses into Kentucky. Pa says to tell you there's an abandoned trapper's cabin about 4 miles along that path. You can shelter there until the storm passes." Thomas pressed a silver coin into the boy's hand. "Tell your father we're grateful for his warning and his discretion." They rode hard despite the increasingly treacherous conditions, the storm unleashing its full fury around them. Rain lashed at their faces, wind whipped through the trees, and lightning split the darkened sky in brilliant, jagged forks. Eleanor clung to her saddle, vision reduced to the dim outline of Thomas, riding just ahead of her. The old trapper's cabin materialized like a mirage through the curtain of rain, a crude structure of logs and rough-hewn planks that had seen better days but still offered solid shelter from the elements. Inside, they found a stone fireplace, a dilapidated bed frame, and little else, but it was dry and defensible. "Wait here," Thomas instructed after helping Eleanor dismount. "I'll secure the horses in that lean-to around back." Alone in the damp, musty cabin, Eleanor attempted to wring water from her sodden clothing. Despite their precarious circumstances, a strange exhilaration coursed through her. Here she was, miles from the only home she'd ever known, fugitive from the man who had raised her, pursuing an uncertain future with a man society deemed inappropriate, and yet she felt more alive, more genuine than she ever had beneath her father's roof. Thomas returned, dripping and breathless, his black hair plastered to his head. "The horses are sheltered," he reported, immediately setting to work on building a fire. And I checked our surroundings. No sign of pursuit. Eleanor helped gather what dry kindling they could find within the cabin. Do you think they followed us from Tennessee, or was this a different group? Impossible to know for certain, Thomas replied, skillfully arranging the kindling, but the timing suggests Blackwood's men. Carson's warning came too quickly after our arrival to be coincidence. You think he betrayed us? The possibility stung after the family's apparent kindness. Thomas struck flint against steel, coaxing a spark into the tinder. Not necessarily. Farms like Carson's see few visitors. Word travels fast in isolated communities. Someone could have spotted us on the approach and sent word ahead. The fire caught, spreading welcome warmth through the cabin's single room. As Thomas added larger pieces of wood, Eleanor contemplated their situation. What do you make of Harlow's offer? She asked. Thomas sat back on his heels, firelight playing across his strong features. It could be genuine. Cumberland Railroad has been in competition with Eastern Valley for years. Using us against Blackwood would serve their interests. But you have reservations. Always. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Railroad companies have their own methods of acquisition that often disadvantage landowners, particularly those without powerful connections. Exchanging Blackwood's persecution for another company's exploitation seems a poor bargain. Eleanor moved closer to the fire, attempting to dry her clothing. Yet we need allies, powerful ones, if we're to counter Blackwood's influence. True. Thomas's expression grew thoughtful. But I prefer allies whose motives I fully understand. Railroad companies operate on profit, not principle. The storm raged through the afternoon and into evening, rattling the cabin shutters and sending occasional trickles of rainwater through the aged roof. They made the best of their circumstances, sharing the provisions Dr. Grant had packed for their journey and spreading their blankets near the fire to create a relatively comfortable resting place. As darkness fell, the close quarters of the cabin took on an unexpected intimacy. Eleanor found herself acutely aware of Thomas's presence, the quiet strength he radiated, the careful consideration he gave her opinions, the way his eyes reflected the dancing flames when he looked at her. "What are you thinking?" he asked, catching her contemplative gaze. "That I've never felt as respected as I do with you," she answered honestly. "Even here, fugitive and rain-soaked, I feel more dignity than I ever did in my father's house." Something powerful and unspoken passed between them, a current stronger than the storm outside. Thomas reached out hesitantly at first to brush a strand of damp hair from her face. The simple touch carried more meaning than any elaborate caress. "Eleanor," he began, his deep voice barely audible above the storm, "if we reach Kentucky safely, if we find sanctuary with Thorne's brother, what future do you envision for yourself?" The question held no presumption, no attempt to guide her answer. Once again, he was offering her the freedom to chart her own course, even if that course led away from him. "I envision a life of purpose," she replied carefully. "Perhaps using my knowledge of medicine to help others, as Dr. Grant encouraged me to do." She met his gaze directly. "And I envision sharing that life with someone who sees me as a partner, not a possession. Someone who values my mind as well as my heart." "There's someone like me!" The vulnerability in his question touched her deeply. "Not someone like you, Thomas. You. Only you." She placed her hand over his, their fingers intertwining naturally. "If you'll have me." His expression transformed, wonder replacing caution. "You understand what that would mean? The challenges we would face? The disapproval from both our peoples?" "I understand that nothing worth having comes without cost," she answered, "and that living by others' expectations is no life at all." Their kiss, when it came, felt inevitable, the natural culmination of a journey that had begun the moment Thomas placed his fortune on William Mitchell's auction table. Unlike their previous exchanges, this held no hesitation, only the certainty of two souls recognizing their match, despite every societal barrier erected to separate them. The storm's fury seemed to echo their own released passions. The winds howl, drowning out the world beyond their shelter. For precious hours, they existed in a realm of their own making, where differences of birth and blood dissolved in the more fundamental recognition of kindred spirits. Morning arrived with unexpected clarity, the storm having spent its violence during the night. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, illuminating their entwined forms beneath shared blankets. Eleanor woke first, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, before memory rushed back, the flight from Carson's farm, the storm, the night with Thomas. She studied his sleeping face, struck by its peaceful vulnerability. Awake, Thomas maintained a necessary vigilance, a warrior's readiness for threats that might emerge from any quarter. In sleep, the burden of that constant awareness lifted, revealing the gentler soul beneath the protective exterior. Not wishing to wake him after their exhausting journey, Eleanor carefully extricated herself from their makeshift bed and moved to the cabin door. Outside, nature had already begun reclaiming equilibrium after the storm's disruption. Birds resumed their territorial songs, droplets sparkled on every surface, and the air carried the clean, renewed scent that follows significant rainfall. She walked a short distance from the cabin, enjoying the simple pleasure of movement without urgency, when a flash of color caught her eye. A patch of wildflowers, their delicate blooms somehow having survived the storm's pummeling, nodded in the gentle morning breeze. Eleanor knelt to examine them, recognizing several varieties her mother had taught her possessed medicinal properties. As she gathered a few specimens, mentally cataloging their potential uses, the distant sound of approaching horses froze her in mid-motion. Rising slowly, she scanned the surrounding forest, heart accelerating when she spotted mounted figures moving along the ridge trail. At least 4 riders, too far to identify, but clearly heading in their direction. Eleanor hurried back to the cabin, pushing through the door with enough force to startle Thomas awake. He was instantly alert, reaching for his rifle before she could speak. "Riders coming along the ridge trail," she reported breathlessly. 4, maybe more, about half a mile out. Thomas moved to the window, positioning himself to observe without being seen. "Did they spot you?" "I don't think so. They were still quite distant when I noticed them." He watched for several moments, his expression growing increasingly grim. 6 riders, well armed, moving with purpose, not random travelers. He turned to Eleanor. "We need to go. Now." They gathered their belongings with practiced efficiency, all trace of the previous night's intimacy subsumed by the more pressing need for survival. Within minutes, they had saddled their horses and prepared to depart. "We can't take the ridge trail," Thomas decided, studying their limited options. "They're too close, and we'd be exposed on the open path." "Is there another route to Kentucky?" Thomas nodded toward the dense forest sloping down from the cabin. "Through there, following the stream valley. It's challenging terrain, but it will hide our passage better than the ridge." As they mounted, Eleanor cast one last glance at the humble cabin that had sheltered both their bodies and the birth of deeper feelings between them. Somehow, she knew this place would remain eternally significant in the story of their lives, whatever the coming hours might bring. They descended into the valley, the going immediately proving more difficult than the established ridge trail. Fallen trees from the storm created natural barriers. The ground was slick with mud, and the stream itself had swollen beyond its banks in places, forcing them to seek alternative crossings. Thomas led with the same quiet confidence he displayed in all wilderness challenges, finding paths where none seemed to exist, identifying the safest routes across treacherous terrain. They maintained silence except for necessary communication, both acutely aware that sound carried deceptively far in the forest's acoustic chambers. By midday, they had covered perhaps half the distance to the Kentucky border, their progress far slower than Thomas had hoped. During a brief rest to water the horses, Eleanor noticed his increasing preoccupation. "You think they're following our trail," she surmised. "I know they are," he corrected grimly. "I've spotted signs of pursuit 3 times in the last hour. They have a tracker with them, someone skilled." The revelation sent a chill through Eleanor, despite the day's mounting heat. How close? Too close. Maybe an hour behind, less if they push hard. Thomas studied the terrain ahead, mentally, calculating options. "We need to increase our pace." "The horses are already struggling with this ground," Eleanor pointed out. "I know." His expression revealed the difficult decision forming in his mind. "Which is why we may need to separate." "No." Her refusal came instantly, viscerally. "Thomas, we agreed to face whatever comes together. And if we continue at this pace, what comes will be capture or worse." His voice remained calm, but carried absolute conviction. "You're nearly at the Kentucky border. The settlement where Thorne's brother lives is directly beyond it. If you follow the stream to its junction with the river, then ride east along the riverbank. You can't miss it. While you do what? Offer yourself as bait?" The very thought made her physically ill. "I'll leave obvious signs, lead them away from your trail. Once they commit to pursuing me, you'll have clear passage to the settlement." Eleanor dismounted, moving to stand directly before him, her gaze unwavering. "I won't do it. I won't leave you to face them alone." "Eleanor." "No." She placed her hand on his, the simple contact conveying her resolve more effectively than any words. "After everything we've survived, everything we've discovered between us, do you truly believe I could ride to safety while knowing you face danger alone?" His expression softened. "It's precisely because of what we've discovered that I want you safe. And it's precisely because of what we've discovered that I cannot abandon you." She smiled sadly. "Besides, even if I reach the settlement, what then? Wait in safety while Blackwood's men hunt you? Build a life wondering if you'll ever return to share it? That's not freedom, Thomas. That's another kind of cage." For several moments, he said nothing, the internal conflict visible in his eyes. Finally, he nodded, acceptance rather than agreement. "Then we continue together. But we'll need to move faster, take more risks than I'd prefer." "I trust your judgment," Eleanor assured him, "and I'm stronger than I look." They resumed their journey with renewed urgency, pushing themselves and their mounts to the limits of endurance. The terrain gradually changed as they descended further into the valley, the forest thinning, the stream widening as it approached its confluence with the larger river that marked the Kentucky border. Late afternoon brought them within sight of the river itself, its broad expanse glittering in the westering sun. The border and potential safety lay tantalizingly close. "We'll cross at that bend," Thomas indicated, pointing to where the river narrowed slightly around a natural curve. "The current is gentler there." They had just started toward the crossing point when the sharp crack of a rifle shot shattered the valley's tranquility. Eleanor's horse reared in panic as a bullet struck a tree mere inches from her head. Thomas reacted instantly, spurring his mount forward to grasp her reins, steadying the frightened animal. "Ride!" he commanded, already turning to locate the shooter. "For the river!" Another shot rang out, closer this time. Thomas's horse screamed in pain as the bullet found its mark, stumbling to its knees before collapsing completely. Thomas barely managed to free himself from the stirrups, rolling clear as the wounded animal thrashed in its death throes. Eleanor pulled her mount around, refusing to flee without him. "Thomas!" He was already on his feet, rifle in hand, scanning the tree line behind them. "Go, I'll cover you. Not without you." She extended her hand toward him, urging her horse closer despite the continuing danger. Before Thomas could respond, 4 riders emerged from the forest, spread in a line that blocked their retreat. At their center rode a familiar figure whose aristocratic bearing seemed incongruous in the wilderness setting. Edgar Blackwood himself, flanked by hired guns whose expressions promised violence without remorse. "How touching," Blackwood called, his cultured voice carrying easily across the distance between them. The savage and his white whore, loyal to the end. Thomas raised his rifle, but Blackwood merely smiled. "I wouldn't if I were you. My men have clear shots at both of you. One move and the girl dies first. You'll follow shortly thereafter." Eleanor felt ice form in her veins as she recognized the truth in Blackwood's threat. They were exposed, outnumbered, with Thomas's mount, dead and her own skittish from the gunfire. For the first time since fleeing Pinecrest Valley, she felt genuine despair threatening to overwhelm her. Thomas slowly lowered his weapon, his expression revealing nothing to their adversaries. "What do you want, Blackwood? You've come a long way for simple revenge." "Revenge?" Blackwood chuckled, the sound utterly devoid of humor. "This was never about revenge, though I'll admit your defiance has made this pursuit particularly satisfying. No, this is business. Everything is always business." He dismounted with deliberate grace, handing his reins to one of his men before approaching them. His expensive boots seemed unsullied by the muddy ground, as though even nature hesitated to mar his immaculate appearance. "You see, Adair, your land remains the final piece in a very valuable puzzle. The railroad demands the most direct route, and that route, unfortunately for you, runs directly through your property and the adjacent Cherokee holdings you've so inconveniently protected from development. So you arranged my father's auction," Eleanor interjected, understanding dawning with sickening clarity, "to control me and through me to pressure Thomas." Blackwood smiled, the expression never reaching his cold eyes. "Precisely. William Mitchell was pathetically easy to manipulate, drowning in debt, desperate for status, blind to his daughter's true worth. When I discovered your connection to Dr. Grant, who in turn had professional dealings with Adair, the opportunity was obvious." "You couldn't simply buy my land?" Thomas asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I tried. You refused every offer, no matter how generous. Your sentimental attachment to land that could generate actual value was most frustrating." Blackwood's lip curled in distaste. But even the most stubborn man reconsiders when someone he cares for is at risk. Thomas's expression hardened. "You miscalculated. I don't respond well to threats." "So it seems." Blackwood sighed theatrically, "which leaves us with less civilized options." He turned to his men. "Secure them both. Kill the horse. We'll have to double ride back to the main trail." As the hired guns moved to obey, a new sound interrupted the confrontation. Hoofbeats approaching rapidly from the direction of the Kentucky border. All heads turned to see a group of riders galloping toward them, at least a dozen strong, led by 2 men whose determined expressions suggested they were no random travelers. "It seems we have unexpected company," Blackwood observed, his confident demeanor showing the first signs of strain. "Who did you contact, Adair?" Thomas appeared genuinely surprised by the newcomers. "No one. We've been running since leaving Carson's farm." Eleanor squinted against the setting sun, trying to identify the approaching riders. As they drew closer, she gasped in recognition. "Thomas, it's Harlow, from the railroad company." "Hazy." Indeed, James Harlow rode at the head of the group, alongside a man Eleanor didn't recognize. Tall, gray-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Behind them came armed men whose matching coats and disciplined formation suggested they weren't ordinary settlers, but an organized security force. Blackwood's men shifted uneasily, clearly reassessing the changing balance of power. Blackwood himself maintained his composure, though his hand moved significantly closer to the pistol at his belt. The riders pulled up 20 yards away, forming a semicircle that effectively surrounded Blackwood's smaller group. Harlow dismounted first, followed by the grey-haired man. To Eleanor's surprise, they were joined by Daniel Carson, the farmer who had offered them brief shelter during the storm. "Mr. Blackwood," Harlow called, his usual affable manner replaced by cold professionalism. "This is an unexpected pleasure." "The sentiment is hardly mutual," Blackwood replied tightly. "This is a private matter between myself and these individuals. I suggest you continue on your way." The grey-haired man stepped forward. "When that private matter involves armed pursuit across territorial boundaries, it becomes considerably less private." He produced a document from inside his coat. "I'm Federal Marshal Jenkins. These men are under my jurisdiction now." A flicker of genuine alarm crossed Blackwood's features before he mastered it. "These fugitives are wanted for crimes committed in Tennessee. I'm simply assisting local authorities in their apprehension." "Curious," the marshal remarked, "since Sheriff Cooper issued no such warrant. In fact, he specifically informed my office that any pursuit of Eleanor Mitchell or Thomas Adair across the Kentucky border would constitute illegal harassment." Blackwood's careful composure cracked. "Cooper has no authority here." "No, but I do," Jenkins replied evenly, "and I have sworn statements from multiple witnesses regarding your threats against these individuals, your attempt to manipulate legal proceedings, and your misrepresentation of property rights." He gestured to Carson, "including this gentleman who overheard your plans to ambush and potentially murder Mr. Adair." Eleanor looked at Carson in astonishment. The farmer nodded slightly, a hint of apology in his weathered features. "Sent my boy to ride for the marshal soon as I recognized Blackwood's men asking after you," he explained. "Figured you might need more help than just directions to a trapper's cabin." Blackwood's hand inched closer to his weapon. "This is absurd. I'm a respected businessman with significant investments throughout the territory. You have no grounds to interfere in a legitimate pursuit of thieves and frauds." "Actually," Harlow interjected, producing documents of his own, "we have extensive grounds. These papers detail your systematic fraud in land acquisitions, your bribing of local officials, and your use of intimidation to force sales." He smiled thinly. "My company has been building this case for months. Your pursuit of Mr. Adair and Miss Mitchell simply accelerated our timeline." For the first time, genuine fear registered in Blackwood's eyes as he realized the trap closing around him. His gaze darted between his men, clearly calculating whether armed resistance might succeed. The marshal recognized the consideration and subtly signaled his own forces to readiness. "I wouldn't," Jenkins advised quietly. "Your men are outnumbered and surrounded. No one needs to die today." The moment balanced on a knife's edge, tension crackling in the air like the electricity before lightning strikes. Then, with visible effort, Blackwood released the breath he'd been holding and raised his hands in a gesture of reluctant surrender. "This isn't over," he promised, his gaze fixing on Thomas and Eleanor with undisguised hatred. "Legal proceedings can be unpredictable. Witnesses recant, evidence disappears. Money still speaks the loudest in these territories." "Perhaps," Marshal Jenkins acknowledged, nodding to his men to secure Blackwood and his companions. "But justice occasionally gets a word in as well." As Blackwood's weapons were confiscated and his hands bound, Eleanor felt the accumulated tension of weeks begin to drain from her body. She leaned against Thomas, suddenly light-headed with relief. "Is it really over?" she whispered, scarcely daring to believe their ordeal might be reaching its conclusion. Thomas's arm encircled her shoulders, solid and reassuring. "Not entirely," he murmured. "Blackwood is right about one thing. Legal battles can be unpredictable, but we have allies now, and time." His embrace tightened slightly. Time to decide our own future without looking over our shoulders. Harlow approached them as the marshal's men led Blackwood and his henchmen away. "You two have led us on quite a chase," he remarked, genuine concern mixing with professional satisfaction. "When Carson's boy reached us with news of Blackwood's pursuit, we feared we might be too late." "You saved our lives," Eleanor acknowledged gratefully, "but I still don't understand why. Thomas hasn't agreed to your railroad proposal." Harlow chuckled. "True enough, but my company plays the long game, Miss Mitchell. Removing Blackwood benefits us regardless of Mr. Adair's decision about his land." He extended his hand to Thomas. "Though I hope our intervention today might favorably dispose you toward future negotiations." Thomas accepted the handshake, with a hint of his rare smile. "It certainly won't harm your prospects." "Excellent," Harlow beamed. "But such discussions can wait for more comfortable surroundings. Marshal Jenkins has offered his protection to the settlement where you were." Heading, "Reverend Thorne's brother is expecting you, has been for days, apparently." As they prepared to depart, Eleanor still mounted, Thomas now sharing Harlow's horse for the short journey to the river crossing, Carson approached, hat in hand. "Wanted to say, I'm sorry for not being entirely forthcoming back at my farm," he said gruffly. "Wasn't sure who to trust when you first arrived. Blackwood's men had been asking after you for days." "You risked your family's safety to warn us," Thomas replied, "and sent for help when it mattered most. There's nothing to apologize for." Carson nodded, seemingly relieved. "My wife said to tell you you're welcome back anytime. She was quite taken with your story." He glanced between them, a hint of genuine curiosity in his eyes. "What will you do now, if you don't mind my asking?" Eleanor and Thomas exchanged glances, a wealth of unspoken communication passing between them. "We haven't decided yet," Eleanor answered honestly, "but for the first time the choice truly feels like ours to make." As their expanded party forded the river into Kentucky, the setting sun bathed the landscape in golden light. Eleanor found herself studying Thomas's profile, marveling at the improbable journey that had brought them to this moment. From the auction block in Pinecrest Valley to the wild freedom of the borderlands, from strangers thrust together by circumstance to partners bound by something far more profound than convenience or necessity. Whatever challenges awaited them beyond the river, legal battles with Blackwood, negotiations with Harlow's company, the inevitable social resistance to their unconventional union, they would face them together, on their own terms. No longer captives of others' expectations or victims of others' greed, but architects of their own destiny. The water swirled around their horses' legs, its current strong but navigable. Eleanor reached out across the space between their mounts, offering her hand to Thomas. He took it without hesitation, his warm grip conveying strength and promise, in equal measure. "Together," she said softly, the word carrying the weight of both history and future. "Always," he replied, the simple response sealing a covenant between them that no law, no social convention, no prejudice could invalidate. As they emerged on the Kentucky shore, leaving Tennessee and its painful memories behind, Eleanor felt a profound sense of transition, not just between territories, but between chapters of existence. Behind lay the life that had been imposed. Upon her, ahead, stretched the life she would create with the man beside her, a man who had valued her freedom more than his own fortune. The settlement founded by Reverend Thorne's brother proved to be larger and more established than Eleanor had anticipated. Nestled in a fertile valley protected by rolling hills, New Hope, as it was aptly named, consisted of several dozen buildings arranged around a central green, with outlying farms extending into the surrounding countryside. Unlike Pinecrest Valley, with its rigid social hierarchies and suspicious insularity, New Hope immediately impressed Eleanor with its atmosphere of pragmatic tolerance. James Thorne, the Reverend's brother, welcomed them into his substantial home with genuine warmth. A barrel-chested man with the same stern features as his clerical sibling, but softened by an easier smile, he showed none of the hesitation Eleanor had feared regarding Thomas's Cherokee heritage. "My brother speaks highly of you both in his letter," Thorne explained, as his wife Sarah served a hearty supper in their comfortable dining room. "Says you've demonstrated more Christian virtue than most who warm church pews every Sunday." Thomas accepted the compliment with his customary reserve. "We simply tried to survive with dignity intact." "Sometimes that's the hardest virtue of all," Thorne observed. "Maintaining dignity when others are determined to strip it away." He regarded them thoughtfully. "My brother mentioned your circumstances are unconventional." Eleanor tensed, slightly waiting for the judgment or conditions that usually followed such observations. Instead, Thorne surprised her. "You'll find New Hope less concerned with conventional arrangements than with character and contribution," he continued. "We judge people by their actions, not their ancestry or circumstances. Thomas's skills as a trader and hunter would be valuable to our community. And my wife tells me you have medical knowledge, Eleanor?" "Some," she acknowledged modestly. "I studied with Dr. Grant in Pinecrest when my father wasn't aware." Sarah Thorne brightened visibly. "We've been praying for someone with healing skills. Our settlement has grown faster than our services. The nearest doctor is 30 miles away." The conversation continued pleasantly, touching on practical matters of accommodation. The Thornes insisted they stay as guests until suitable housing could be arranged, and potential opportunities within the community. Not once did their hosts question the nature of Eleanor and Thomas's relationship or suggest any impropriety in their traveling together. Later, settled in separate but adjacent rooms in the Thornes' spacious home, Eleanor and Thomas finally had a moment to absorb the day's dramatic reversals. "Do you think Blackwood will find a way to continue his persecution?" she asked, her voice low to avoid disturbing their hosts. Thomas considered the question with his usual thoroughness. "He'll try. Men like Blackwood don't surrender power easily, but Marshal Jenkins seemed competent, and Harlow's company has financial resources to match Blackwood's. The balance has shifted in our favor. And this place, New Hope, what do you think?" A rare smile softened his features. "I think it lives up to its name." The Thornes seemed genuine in their welcome, though time will test the community's broader acceptance. Eleanor moved closer, drawn to his solid presence after the day's dangers. "And us? What do you think about us?" Thomas's expression grew, serious, as he gently took her hands in his. "I think we've been given a rare opportunity to define ourselves on our own terms. No expectations from your father, no prejudices from my past, just the future we choose to build." He hesitated, then continued with careful deliberation. "If that future includes formalizing our bond, I would consider myself the most fortunate of men." The proposal, couched in Thomas's characteristically measured language, nonetheless stole Eleanor's breath. "Are you asking me to marry you, Thomas Adair?" "If you would consider it," he replied, a hint of vulnerability showing through his composure. "Though I understand if you need time to—" Eleanor silenced him with a kiss, brief but fervent. "I don't need time. I've already chosen you in every way that matters. The ceremony would simply acknowledge what we already know to be true." Relief and joy transformed his features, making him appear younger, unburdened by the vigilance that had been his constant companion. "Then yes, Eleanor Mitchell, I am asking you to be my wife, to share whatever life we create, whatever challenges we face, whatever joys we discover. Yes, she answered simply, the single syllable containing multitudes of meaning. Yes, to all of it. They sealed this second covenant with another kiss, this one unhurried and profound, a physical manifestation of the commitment they had just exchanged. When they finally separated, Eleanor felt a certainty she had never experienced before. Not the false security of her father's house or the temporary safety of Thomas's cabin, but the enduring stability of a choice freely made and a love freely given. The following weeks unfolded with unexpected smoothness. News arrived that Edgar Blackwood faced multiple charges of fraud, intimidation, and conspiracy. His financial empire crumbling as investors withdrew support and authorities examined his business practices. William Mitchell, implicated in several of Blackwood's schemes, had apparently fled Tennessee for parts unknown, leaving behind debts and broken relationships, but taking with him, Eleanor hoped, some lesson from his failures as both businessman and father. New Hope proved true to James Thorne's description. While not entirely free from prejudice, certain residents maintained distance from Thomas based on his heritage. The majority welcomed the newcomers based on their obvious skills and contributions. Eleanor's medical knowledge quickly made her indispensable, particularly among the settlement's women who preferred a female healer for certain conditions. Thomas established trading connections with both white settlements and nearby indigenous communities, his unique position between worlds becoming an asset rather than a liability. They married on a clear autumn day, with James Thorne officiating a ceremony that blended Christian traditions with Cherokee elements Thomas remembered from his childhood. The settlement turned out in force, curiosity perhaps motivating some. Attendees, but genuine goodwill evident among many others. Even Daniel Carson and his family made the journey from their farm to witness the union they had indirectly helped preserve. "I never thought I'd see this day," Eleanor confessed to Thomas as they shared a quiet moment during the celebration that followed their vows. "Not just marriage, but a life of my own choosing. A future based on mutual respect, rather than ownership or obligation." Thomas's gaze, warm with love and pride, traced the features that had become his definition of home. "You were always meant for freedom, Eleanor. From the moment I saw you on that auction block, dignity intact despite your father's cruelty, I knew you possessed a spirit no one could truly cage." "You gave everything to free me," she reminded him, still humbled by the magnitude of his sacrifice. "And received everything in return," he countered, gesturing subtly toward their gathered well-wishers, a partner, a community, a purpose beyond mere survival. His voice deepened with emotion. "You freed me too, Eleanor. From solitude, from the space between worlds where I never fully belonged." In the years that followed, their union became a cornerstone of New Hope's identity, a living testament to the community's founding principles of tolerance and practical cooperation. When children came, 2 sons and a daughter, carrying the physical markers of both their heritages, the settlement embraced them as symbols of its own future, where artificial divisions might gradually dissolve in favor of shared humanity. Occasionally, travelers from Tennessee brought news of Pinecrest Valley. Edgar Blackwood had served a brief prison term before emerging much diminished in wealth and influence. The railroad had ultimately been built along a route that circumvented both Blackwood's acquired properties and Thomas's ancestral land, a compromise engineered by Harlow that satisfied commercial interests while preserving indigenous territories. William Mitchell had reportedly died in St. Louis, bitter and alone, never having reconciled with the daughter he had once treated as merchandise. Eleanor received this last piece of news with complex emotions, grief not for the man her father had become, but for the relationship they might have had under different circumstances. Thomas, understanding her conflicted heart as only he could, suggested a simple ceremony of remembrance. Not for William Mitchell specifically, but for all they had left behind in pursuing their freedom. "The past shapes us," he observed as they stood together on the hill overlooking their homestead, watching their children play in the distance. "But it need not define us. Your father taught you resilience through his cruelty. My mixed heritage taught me to navigate between worlds. Without those challenges, we might never have developed the strength to forge our own path." Eleanor leaned into his solid presence, drawing comfort from the wisdom that had guided them through both adversity and prosperity. "Do you ever regret it? The gold you spent, the life you left behind?" Thomas's arm tightened around her shoulders as he gazed at their thriving farm, their healthy children, the community that had accepted them more fully than either had dared to hope. "Not for a single moment," he answered, the absolute conviction in his voice requiring no further elaboration. As dusk settled over New Hope, painting the valley in hues of amber and purple, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her from captivity to freedom, from objectification to partnership, from her father's property to her own identity. The path had been neither straight nor easy, marked by danger and sacrifice, yet every step had led her toward this moment of quiet contentment, beside the man who had valued her liberty above all else. In freeing her, Thomas Adair had given Eleanor Mitchell more than escape from an unwanted marriage. He had given her the most precious gift possible, the opportunity to discover her own worth, independent of others' valuations. And in accepting that gift, she had offered him an equally valuable treasure, belonging, connection, and a love unbound by society's narrow definitions of acceptability. Together, they had written a story neither could have created alone. Not a fairy tale of rescue and passive gratitude, but a complex human narrative of mutual liberation, shared struggle, and enduring commitment to something larger than themselves. A vision of life where freedom and love existed not as separate ideals, but as complementary aspects of the same profound truth. And that Eleanor knew with bone-deep certainty as she watched the first stars appear above their home, was a story worth every hardship they had endured to tell it. Eleanor stood on tiptoe to kiss him softly, the gesture as natural and necessary as breathing. "The best decision I ever made," she murmured against his lips, meaning both the long-ago choice to trust this extraordinary man and the current decision to share their story with Margaret Blackwood's foundation. Their partnership with the Blackwood Foundation flourished over the following years, expanding beyond expectations. Eleanor's practical experience combined with Margaret's social connections and financial resources created a powerful force for change. Women across the territories sought their assistance, finding not just material support, but inspiration, proof that even seemingly insurmountable obstacles could be overcome with courage and the right allies. Thomas, too, found unexpected fulfillment in their new endeavors. His unique perspective as a man of mixed heritage gave him insight into other forms of prejudice and exclusion. The foundation gradually expanded its mission to assist not only women in difficult circumstances, but also families facing discrimination based on race or background. The skills that had once helped Thomas survive as an outsider now helped others navigate hostile social terrain. On the 10th anniversary of the Foundation's establishment, a celebration was held in New Hope, now a thriving town with its own railway station, newspaper, and growing reputation for progressive values. Representatives from similar organizations across the country gathered to share strategies and successes. At the center of it all stood Eleanor and Thomas, their 3 children now young adults, pursuing their own paths. Joshua as a lawyer specializing in indigenous land rights, Catherine as a physician trained at one of the new women's medical colleges, and Samuel as an aspiring writer documenting the changing frontier. If someone had told me 20 years ago that my father selling me at auction would lead to all this, Eleanor remarked to Thomas as they watched the gathering from the porch of their expanded homestead. "I would have thought them mad." Thomas's smile held the wisdom of their shared journey. "Life's greatest gifts often come disguised as its harshest challenges," he observed, taking her hand in his. "Your father's cruelty gave you the opportunity to discover your own strength. Blackwood's persecution forced us to find a community that valued character above convention. And your sacrifice gave me the freedom to become more than someone's daughter or wife," Eleanor added, leaning against his shoulder. "Though I could never have imagined becoming a symbol for others seeking their own liberation." Their quiet reflection was interrupted by Margaret Blackwood, now in her 80s but still formidable, approaching with a telegram in hand. "Remarkable news," she announced, dispensing with preamble as was her custom. "The legislature has passed the Property Rights Act. Married women can now legally control their own earnings and inheritances throughout the territory." The announcement represented years of persistent advocacy, countless meetings with reluctant politicians, and strategic use of both economic pressure and public opinion. Eleanor felt momentary disbelief, then profound satisfaction. "This will change countless lives," she said, the physician in her already calculating the practical implications. Women trapped in bad marriages for financial reasons, widows vulnerable to unscrupulous relatives, daughters denied their rightful inheritances. And it began with one woman refusing to be sold like property, Margaret reminded her, the respect in her voice evident despite her brisk manner. "Never underestimate the power of a single act of defiance, Mrs. Adair. It creates ripples that eventually become waves." As Margaret moved on to share the news with other attendees, Thomas slipped his arm around Eleanor's waist. "Proud of you," he said simply, the three words carrying the weight of decades of shared struggles and triumphs. "Of us," Eleanor corrected, her gaze taking in their home, their grown children discussing campaign strategies with young activists, the community that had embraced them despite their unconventional beginning. "Everything meaningful we've accomplished has been partnership." That evening, after the celebrations concluded and their guests departed, Eleanor and Thomas walked to the hilltop overlooking their property. The setting sun painted the valley in hues of gold and amber, silhouetting the town they had helped shape and the mountains that had sheltered their early flight from persecution. "Do you ever wonder what became of your father?" Thomas asked, the rare question about her past, indicating the reflective mood the day's events had inspired. Eleanor considered this. "Occasionally. Last I heard, he died alone in St. Louis, never acknowledging his wrongs." She shook her head sadly. "I've made peace with that part of my history. He gave me life, if nothing else, and his failures taught me what true strength looks like." "And what does it look like?" Thomas asked, curious about her perspective after all these years. "Like you," she answered without hesitation. "Standing alone at that auction, placing everything you had on that table to free a stranger. Like Margaret, transforming her suffering into purpose. Like every woman who's walked through our door with nothing but hope and determination, ready to rebuild her life from ashes." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "And like you, facing each new challenge with that same quiet resolve I saw 20 years ago, when you looked your father in the eye and walked away from everything you'd known." They stood in companionable silence as twilight deepened around them, two people who had defied convention, prejudice, and seemingly insurmountable odds to forge a life on their own terms. Their story had become legend in certain circles. The Cherokee warrior who outbid everyone to free a woman being sold by her cruel father. But the reality was both simpler and more profound than any legend could capture. It was the story of two souls, recognizing in each other not just allies against immediate danger, but partners in the more enduring challenge of creating a life of meaning and purpose. It was the story of freedom, not as an abstract principle, but as the daily practice of choice, respect, and mutual support. And it was the story of love, not as romantic fantasy, but as the steady commitment to seeing another person's full humanity when the rest of the world refused to look. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, Eleanor leaned against Thomas, still her anchor after all these years. "We should head back," she suggested. "The children will be waiting." "In a moment," Thomas replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the last light lingered. "I just want to remember this. Everything we've built, everything we've become. From that auction block to this hillside, from strangers to family, from outcasts to community." Eleanor followed his gaze, understanding completely. "It was worth it," she said softly. "Every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of uncertainty, all of it." "All of it," Thomas agreed, turning to face the woman whose freedom had ultimately freed him as well. "And I would do it all again, 100 times over for the same result." Hand in hand, they walked back toward the lights of home, their silhouettes merging into one against the gathering darkness. Two people who had refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose, creating instead a legacy of liberation that would extend far beyond their own lifetimes, touching countless others they would never meet, but who would find their own paths to freedom inspired by the courage of those who had gone before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.